So I've been asked to speak on the theme of nature recovery, which is a very, very important subject, as you will all know, in this room. But sometimes I feel as though speaking to people not steeped in the details of what's going on, that they feel as though things broadly are okay. A beautiful green and pleasant land that we live in, a little bit warmer than usual, they may find, but nonetheless, it seems like things aren't that bad. If you zoom out, however, to take the global view of what's going on at the moment, I fear there are some really quite troubling trends in play. And we've known about them for really quite a long time. And I was there in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit when the world decided that we needed to create international agreements to deal with climate change and the loss of biological diversity. And for more than 3 decades, we've been working to those treaty processes to help to disentangle human impacts from the state of the natural world. To put it mildly, I think it's fair to say that we're not making sufficient progress. So despite 30 years of commitments and target setting, guess which year had the highest emissions of greenhouse gases in human history? It was 2024. Going up year by year, even after that summit agreement in 1992, to the point where this year we've now just passed 450 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere, a concentration of CO2 probably not seen on this planet for 14 million years, would you believe? Last year, in the wake of this accumulation of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, which is now changing the fundamental composition of the envelope of gases which sustain life on this planet, we now find that temperatures have gone into a level of warming that was deemed in the Paris Agreement of 2015 to be in the danger zone, 1.5 degrees of global warming. And in the wake of that, you see a series of extreme conditions that are very much in the climate models that were being prepared decades ago. More extreme rainfall events. You will have seen one in your TV screens in Texas last week, a catastrophic one in southern Spain at the end of 2024. Weather records in terms of temperature being smashed all over the place literally every week, including June temperature records in southern Europe. This year you would have seen temperatures on the screens, the meteorological screens in southern Spain, well into the mid-40s. This week in the Himalayas, even at nearly 3,000 meters above sea level, temperatures touching 40 degrees in the Himalayas. In the wake of those extreme weather conditions, in terms of temperature and rainfall, you find a series of human impacts in terms of damage to property and livelihoods, economic impacts, and on top of the rain and the droughts, we have incredibly powerful storms now being generated at a more frequent and bigger level than was historically the case. And we've got data showing all of this, and we know it is linked to the progressive build-up of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, trapping more of the sun's energy, changing the conditions which have enabled human civilizations to emerge to the point that we've reached today. Less in the news, in some ways more profound and with even wider ramifications, is the decline of nature and the unravelling of the web of life in which human civilization is embedded. And you see different manifestations of this coming through in the different data sets being prepared by the scientists. One of them relates to the abundance of nature. Anyone who's been paying attention to the state of the natural world, as I have been now for decades, you can see that things are different. Where I live in East Anglia, and thankfully it seems to be a bit better here, but in East Anglia, the bird song is now noticeably more quiet than it was a couple of years ago. And this year, the dawn chorus nearly silent in central Cambridge. Blackcaps, dunnocks, blackbirds, song thrushes, now very few left, and some of them now completely absent. Chaffinches, greenfinches, song thrushes gone, alongside many of the insects, which in the summertime, of course, butterflies would be something we take utterly for granted. I was at my allotment the other evening and there were no butterflies, whereas a few years ago they would be flying clouds of whites, a few ringlets, some gatekeepers, and the odd tortoiseshells on a few bits of buddleia, literally no butterflies. And the Loss of abundance is reflected in some global data sets. One of the most thorough is the Living Planet report prepared by WWF and the London Zoological Society. They've been mapping the biomass of vertebrates going back to 1970, air-breathing vertebrates, so mammals, birds and reptiles. The headline figure is that we have 75% fewer of those animals compared with 1970. This is less than a single human lifetime. We have seen a 3/4 reduction in the abundance of those animals. This is terrifying. Yet, looking out of the train window on a beautiful sunny day, the place looks green and pleasant, and yet the decline of nature is taking place before our very eyes. And alongside the decline of abundance, of course, is the ever-lengthening list of species deemed at risk of extinction. And the red data books prepared by the World Conservation Union, every time the scientists go back to look at a group, freshwater fishes, amphibians, birds, mammals, you name it, the list is getting longer year by year. And on top of the collapsing abundance and the species that are now heading towards the back door of oblivion via extinction is the collapse of entire ecosystems. And you see this again in your news screens periodically, a massive bleaching event affecting the Great Barrier Reef on the east coast of Australia. That's a story that comes back with depressing regularity. Some parts of that reef now are pretty lifeless compared to a few decades ago. And of course, on some of the big terrestrial ecosystems, you can see the dynamics that enable places like the Amazon rainforest to function. It's beginning to creak. It's showing real signs of stress as the hydrology of the whole system is now being put at risk via fragmentation of the rainforest. And then come closer to home and you see the scale of losses here. And again, that green and pleasant land out there is very, very different to how it was even just a few decades ago. And some of the statistics on this are truly horrific. We've now got something like 2% of the original native woodland that we had in this country. And some of the figures relating to semi-natural grasslands are truly terrifying. I visited a place called Achurch Meadow in Northamptonshire a couple of weeks ago with the Floodplain Meadows Partnership, a fantastic coalition of academics and NGOs who are looking at the value of floodplain meadows, where they're still left, and the strategies we might adopt for their recovery. And this particular place, it is awesome in terms of the diversity of insects and plants in there, and the connection with the river is still intact. And this place is storing carbon, it's catching nutrients, it's reducing flooding. And yet that one is an example now, which is a very rare remaining example of an ecosystem which is now 99% depleted in this country. We've lost something like 97% of our flower-rich grasslands, I'm told. In the case of the floodplain meadows, it's nearly up to 100%. So we've pushed things down to a pretty low level. And I think this invites the question of why this is the case. Because everything I've just told you is well known, it's documented, it's in peer-reviewed journals, it's in the news, and yet still finds trouble connecting with the way in which we choose to run our societies. And this is a really important question. I thought about this a lot, and I think probably the challenge comes down to the fact that we have lost connection with the natural world to the point whereby we feel as though it is rational to assume that the loss of nature and the pollution of the atmosphere, these are regrettable, but nonetheless inevitable things we must tolerate in order to pursue economic growth. Because economic growth is the thing that gives us jobs, it gives us prosperity, and it gives us human comfort and well-being. And there's an awful lot to be said about that. Trouble is, of course, is that this is completely wrong. And we know it's completely wrong because nature underpins every segment of our economic and social system. If you remove nature, our economy will collapse. And we're already beginning to see elements of this as extreme weather is now exacting a terrible toll on the insurance system. And closer to home, last year, £1 billion wiped off farm incomes, I'm told, as a result of the extreme weather we had during the early part of 2024. That was extreme wetness last year, extreme dryness this year. The economic system is already beginning to be buffeted by this change that's taking place in the air, but also the lack of resilience in the land and sea to be able to cope with these kinds of shocks. And you look at the value of nature in terms of the underpinning of public health and well-being, it's absolutely huge. It's contributing billions of pounds to the National Health Service in terms of the avoided costs of drugs and treatments for people made sick through the lifestyle that we now very often pursue because of the culture that now is embedded across the country. And of course, there's huge numbers linked with the benefits that we can get from nature in being able to hold carbon in the atmosphere, as well as being able to help us adapt to some of the changes which are now inevitable. And when it comes to the role of nature in the carbon cycle, I was very interested recently to read the figures for greenhouse gas emissions where I live in Cambridgeshire. Would you believe a full quarter of the emissions in that county, bigger than transport, is the loss of carbon coming out of the degrading peatlands in the East Anglian fenlands, which are being ploughed and drained still in order to create an illusion of food security. And that's an illusion because in the end, the more we deplete our natural capital of soils, of freshwater aquifers, of pollinating insects, of natural pest control, never mind a stable climate, which economic sector is going to being hit first and hardest by that? Of course, it's our food system. But we're still in a national conversation that says actually food is more important than nature, and we shouldn't be focusing on nature recovery because actually the thing we've got to do is focus on food security. It's a disastrously disconnected mindset that we have fallen into, whereby we now believe collectively as a society that somehow there is a choice between looking after the natural world and looking after human well-being. Actually, I say we've fallen into that collective mindset. I think quite a lot of people don't believe it, but it is still nonetheless conveyed in the media pretty much every day. I don't know if any of you might have noticed a few speeches taking place over recent months whereby we are being told that the reason we can't build houses and grow the economy is because of newts and bats. Let me tell you, I'm quite close to these subjects and that is not true. However, the story prevails in the media because it portrays a certain mindset that takes us in certain directions. Having said all of that, and recognising this huge ecological challenge that we've got, and the fact that we still dwell in a world whereby we're misrepresenting the choices at hand, there has been some progress in being able to set a path towards a different future. And some of that I mentioned a moment ago in terms of those global treaty processes. Some of you will have heard of the Paris Agreement, which sets a global target to limit emissions, to keep global temperature increase as close to 1.5 degrees as possible and below 2 degrees. That is evidently something which needs more attention. In parallel to that global framework is another one that you may not have heard about called the Global Biodiversity Framework, adopted in Montreal at the Biodiversity Talks in 2022, which sets a series of 23 targets which the world should meet by 2030 to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity. And actually, what's in there and what is in national policy now is really interesting. And this brings me to the phrase nature recovery, because there has been a recasting of this whole discussion over the last probably 8 to 10 years, whereby, and it might be interesting for someone to do a word search of this in the internet or something, to see the relative use of the word conservation compared with that of nature recovery. They're kind of used interchangeably, but they're different. And they're different in a way which is really quite profound and really quite important, because conservation is the mindset that we adopted here and in other countries in the post-war years, where we realised there's not much of that wonderful wild nature left, the wild species that people were interested in, rare butterflies, rare birds, rare habitats. We've got to draw lines on maps and protect those. And it was a perfectly rational response at the time. But nature recovery is something different, because this is not about only holding on to what happens to have survived a period of industrial agriculture and industrialisation and urbanisation and fragmentation. This is a different project about restoring a lot of what has gone. And that's in the Global Biodiversity Framework to an extent at least, but actually is an explicit policy in England introduced in 2018 in the 25-year environment plan, where nature recovery and leaving things better than we found them for future generations becomes an explicit object of government policy. And that was really significant and can't be underestimated in terms of how it resets the frame that we now work in looking to the future. Because the truth is, we don't have enough nature anymore. It's no good just conserving the few bits to the left. We need more nature to catch carbon, to promote public health and well-being, to recharge aquifers, to reduce flooding, and of course to hang on to the biodiversity and expand it. So this is now a programme which is not a defensive one. This is one about ambition, recovery, rebuilding green infrastructure in order that we can not only protect the beauty and the wonders of nature, but also protect the well-being of human societies and human economies. This is a very different story compared to the one that we were working within until quite recently. Now, when it comes to the practicalities of what we're going to do about this, that 25-year environment plan, it led to a cascade of policies that have been developed by government over recent years, kicked off by Michael Gove, who actually hired me to work at Natural England, which everyone thought was quite surprising. No one was more surprised than me. And the fact that I'm still there is even more surprising, especially when I say things like I say in various places. But I'm sure none of you will quote me. And the consequence of that shift is seen in agricultural policy and in the targets being set nationally for nature in terms of protected areas and everything else. And actually, it's now quite a rich menu of things that we've got to work with. To say that we've arrived at where we need to be, no, we haven't. Have we turned the corner? Probably we have turned the corner in policy, and actually we've turned an even more important corner that I'll come to in a moment. But in terms of the policy mix which is now available to us, switching farm payments from area payments to nature outcomes is massively significant. This is in the global biodiversity framework, whereby countries said we should switch the $500 billion, 500 billion of harmful subsidies being spent across the world. Fossil fuels and agriculture are two of the big headings, whereby governments and taxpayers are funding industry and companies to basically degrade ecosystems and the atmosphere. This is madness. So thing number one, switch the subsidies, and that is embedded in policy in England. It's complicated, it's fraught, it's clunky, it's frustrating, it's hard to get your head around it, and there's still work to do. But turning that corner from paying people for managing land and into some environmental outcomes is very significant. And we can see some really good things happening on the ground as a result of that. And most excitingly for us at Natural England is the so-called landscape recovery projects. 56 of these now running across the country, 3 of them here in Dartmoor. And the idea of these is to take action at scale, because we know if we're going to halt and reverse the decline of nature, to go towards recovery, we've got to do more than field by field and hedge by hedge. We've got to start thinking across the entire landscape. And the landscape recovery projects are enabling some of that to now occur. And I've been in the field now to look at many of these, and I've just been hugely impressed by not only the ecological ambition that's there, but actually the thing that is really, really striking is how those projects are enabling people to connect across landscapes. And so for some years we had these farmer cluster ideas, absolutely fantastic and wonderful ones across the country you can see where people are working together, multiple farms, beginning to build a picture whereby cooperation and a strategic view is being taken forward collectively. There's one at Martin Down, around one of the wonderful national nature reserves down there on the border of Wiltshire and Dorset. That's one example amongst many of where people are beginning to think about how they can act together. And the landscape recoveries are facilitating more of this. And I think in some ways it's a bit like using social capital and building social capital, all those connections between the people in the landscape to rebuild the natural capital is one way of looking at it. And that's beginning to work. So we've got that. That's going to be helpful. Another thing we've got is some sense of strategic priorities we can adopt at county level, like Devon, for example, through local nature recovery strategies. These are a mechanism for spatial planning still need to do more with them. However, a new way of being able to take a view across a large area as to where we've still got good nature and where it would be sensible to rebuild nature. Those are coming through, and at Natural England we're very excited about the possibilities that will come from those to be unleashing partnerships at ground level to do good new things. On top of that, we have the mechanism of biodiversity net gain. Gets a lot of airtime and a lot of chat about it. That's fine, it is a good policy, but quite niche in replying to house building so far. Very soon we're hoping it will also apply to infrastructure, and so we'll be able to see more resources coming for nature recovery linked to the built environment. And on top of that, we have opportunities, largely unrealised I would say, but to rebuild green infrastructure to unleash the power of nature-based solutions. So more species-rich grasslands as a strategy to reduce flooding and replenish aquifers. Yes, we could do that. And if we can get more join up between these policy areas, maybe over the years ahead, we'll start to see more of this kind of integrated thinking turning into integrated delivery. So there's quite a rich mix of policies, and there's quite a compelling set of targets coming from the global level down to national level, and then being in some part reflected at county level. But the thing that is going to make the actual difference is not really the policy. That's a framework, it's a helpful template. The bit that creates the colour in the template and which paints the picture is the people who live and work in the landscape. And I mentioned the landscape recoveries as one example of this. And those really are unleashing a lot of energy that is derived from people beginning to think differently. And I was struck at Groundswell the other day, another example of this huge shift that's taking place in perspective, where I heard from Gabe Brown, one of the champions of the regenerative farming movement, who said, if you do things differently, you get small change. If you want to see big change, you need to see things differently. And this, it appears to me, is beginning to happen. Because at Groundswell, which is a gathering of farming people for the most part, some NGOs there and some scientists and regulators and government agencies like us, I went there 3 years ago and it was about a quarter of the size it was this year. Something major is happening at ground level, literally a groundswell. They got a good name for that particular farming festival, because it is, I think, the case that a change is taking hold at ground level. And this is the most encouraging thing of all, because if you look at those global treaty targets and even the targets adopted by countries, they are going to count for nothing if things don't happen in particular fields, around particular villages and in particular river catchments, because the global sum of human impact is derived from decisions taken in little places. And the aggregate effect of that scales up to be represented in the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and in the decline of biodiversity. So if we, as people, decide to do things differently, we can have a bottom-up movement that meets the top-down ambition. And that is exactly what seems to be occurring. And I have to say, More Meadows is a fantastic example of the kind of change which is rapidly taking place over a short time. And Donna, I can't congratulate you enough in taking this from an idea 10 years ago into a meeting like this, represented in thousands of hectares of land, now being turned into well-managed species-rich grasslands, which will deliver society all sorts of benefits, as well as giving the people who are doing it enormous pride and enjoyment in the process. And that, I think, is the key to what we now need to really focus on in unlocking the potential to meet those 2030 targets on nature, because if we don't harness the commitment, the passion, the inspiration of people, we won't get there. The good news is that we can do it, and you're all sitting in a meeting today which is proof of that. And actually, if there's one thing which I think is more compelling than all the data, all the science and all the things that we might put in front of people as rational arguments as to why we should do this or that, the thing that really changes people's minds is seeing other people doing something which is better than what they were doing already. And seeing a beautiful meadow full of plants and insects compared to something which is shorn down, baked up in the sun? Which one would you prefer to look at and to be proud of? And I think by doing these things, it sends a message which you would not get from 1,000 papers published in the journal Nature. But the recovery of nature is evidently doable, it's possible, and living proof comes from more meadows. So thank you, Donna, for getting us all together, and thank you for the progress you've made in inspiring this excellent body of work. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, you've got some cues from those.
In May this year, Natural England published the assessments of the SSI status on Dartmoor's Commons.
Yep.
Of 24,000 hectares surveyed, only 26 hectares was in favourable condition. What do we need to do?
Change is going to have to occur to the way the land is managed. An awful lot of complexity in all of that, as anyone who's paying attention to this will appreciate. A combination of altering grazing practices to hopefully diminish the spread of millennia, doing more to bring water back to the landscape, which is a key management objective. Those are the kinds of headings that need to follow from those conclusions. But everyone who is seeing what is being debated here will know that this is not at heart, in the end, going to be solved by science. This is a socio-economic question that requires people to be working together in how they manage their land towards common objectives. And the process of getting people from where they are to where ideally we would be in an ecological sense is something which is not without its complexities, let's say. But government has put in place a so-called land use management group for Dartmoor, which is bringing together all of the interests, which hopefully quite soon will lead to some conclusions that are going to align the rural businesses here with the recovery of the nature. And, you know, the picture is made considerably more complicated still insofar as some of the tools that government and its agencies have, you know, in terms of incentivising different kinds of farming practices, they don't necessarily enable us to get our arms around some of the other bigger things that are going on, linked to air pollution and nitrogen deposition, for example, plus also the challenges embedded in climate change, including longer and more severe droughts. So it's a tricky picture, but we've reached a place which really is not ideal, very, very far from ideal in terms of what Dartmoor should look like and what it should be like, according to the official designations put in place by government agencies years ago that declare parts of it not only sites of special scientific interest, but also internationally important. It's gone down very, very far. It needs to come back up again. And we're in the process of trying to make that happen through whatever means that we have at our disposal, including the science. But I would say that the science is going to have to be connected to a discussion that makes sense to the people who live here. And as you will appreciate, opinions have been divided about how to go forward. And the trouble with science as well, actually, is that it gives you a snapshot of what's happened and of the past. What it can't necessarily do is give you a very clear view of the future. And that future is not only going to be painted by having good data and good ecological information, it is going to be down to people wanting to work together to do the same thing over a large area of countryside. Actually, one of the things that is really a source of hope for me is not only the land use management group, but also the work the Duchy is doing in that big West Cornwall landscape recovery. Prince of Wales came down, I met him a couple of weeks ago, and just heard from him how much effort he wants to put in to turning the good ideas that are there about joining up rural economy and nature recovery and putting them into practice. And there are a lot of voices and a lot of important actors who I think are now on that journey. It's not going to be instant, unfortunately. And you know, the decline wasn't instant either. It's taken place over a period of years, and it's going to take us a while to get back on a good trajectory. But getting everyone on that good trajectory is a social project as well as one of data and condition assessments.
Sorry, one question next to the other. Tony, thank you for a really good talk and a really inspiring talk with respect to also the role of Natural England in infusing and getting positive action. But I have a question about the other side of things. So I think it's pretty well known that the last government eroded environmental regulation across the agencies and eroded the staff to do that. And we all know about the state of our rivers, but it's really good now to see the Environment Agency in this area being given more resources and more direction to enforce the law with respect to water quality. Do you think that Natural England could now be given more of a role and a stronger role again in enforcing SSSI law, where farmers are encouraged and there's lots of schemes to help, but if a farmer absolutely refused to keep within the law with respect to what the SSSI needed, would you welcome Natural England being given a stronger direction to enforce as well?
Yeah, so we have enforcement powers, and they are used from time to time. But they, and I think it's right that we use that as a last resort backstop, because we do want to work with people. We do want to find ways in which there's an accommodation between the needs of the people who own the land and the collective interest in maintaining the biodiversity. So the process of engagement and encouragement is one that I think actually in terms of government, there's more we could do there in terms of lining up some of the incentives coming from the agri-environment schemes, for example, with good management for SSSIs. And we used to have a budget for this years ago, Conservation Enhancement Scheme, I think it was called. I'm getting a nod here from Wildlife Enhancement Scheme. Yeah, Wildlife Enhancement Scheme, which gave us a set of resources to be able to encourage people to do good things with their SSSIs. We have much less of that now, like none. So that is a tool that needs to be in the box, which isn't there at the moment. And we have had a conversation with officials in DEFRA about the extent to which we might use the new countryside stewardship higher tier scheme to be able to create that encouragement to be able to do that. Having said that, there are times when people refuse and they take a dim view of nature and its agencies, and they feel as though they don't wish to abide by the legislative requirements, and they do damage. And from time to time, resources permitting, we take action. And this is hugely complicated and, depending on the case, hugely demanding of our time and our resources, literally costing many, many thousands of pounds, tens of thousands of pounds very often. But we do get results, and the River Lug case in Herefordshire a couple of years ago is an example of where a successful prosecution was brought against a landowner who did very serious damage to an SAC river, and I think was the first time an imprisonment was handed down for damage to a SSSI. So that kind of enforcement does occur. Bear in mind, the other thing actually, on the other end of the spectrum, we've only got so many lawyers, and they spend quite a lot of time in court dealing with claims being brought by conservation agencies against Natural England for this or that. Don't like the hen harrier brood management scheme, which is a government policy which we're implementing. Some people don't like it, so they bring legal actions, and so a lot of our legal bandwidth goes into those kinds of cases as well, which is fine, and that's part of the process, and everyone should have a right to be able to challenge official decisions, but it does have implications for our resource base and where we can deploy it for the kinds of things that might be pointing in the other direction. But we'd like more resources. Just actually on the resources side, I must speak up for the backing that Natural England did get over recent years. So when I came to Natural England, the budget was about £100 million in 2019. Last year, we're over 300 million. So there's been a significant increase in the budget linked to some of those policies I talked about a moment ago in terms of things that government did in that intervening period after the 25-year environment plan. We're in a period of squeeze at the moment because money is tight. I mean, you don't need to go very far to look at the news and everything else to realise that government budgets are under a lot of pressure, and these are big political decisions way outside our remit in terms of what Treasury will think in terms of what's more important: defence, health, education, work and pensions, environment. And then in the environment bit, you've got flooding, agriculture, food, climate adaptation. I mean, all these things are actually connected, which is a whole other story. But at the bottom of that comes, or in that mix rather, comes nature. And so, a small departmental budget divided across multiple headings, and we're in that mix of things. But it's being determined, the overall envelope, in a national picture, which is very challenging. And I really don't envy colleagues working in the Treasury trying to make it all add up at the moment, because it is very, very difficult. But we will do our very best with the resources we've got. We're spending taxpayers' money, and so we need to lever the maximum benefit we can out of that for nature, recognising that we need to be bringing people with us at the same time. And I can tell you it ain't easy, but we do our best.
A fantastic talk, Tony. Thank you very much. I work with farmers, and we can categorically say now that if you abuse nature, your profitability will go down. However, the support system is not helpful.
No.
80% of farmers are unprofitable before support, and yet they see support as a revenue into their business rather than a way to improve natural capital. How do we change that?
Yeah. So, well, this is one of the big switches, and I mentioned it a moment ago, that took place in the wake of our departure from the European Union, was this move away from area payments, which people had gotten used to, haven't they, over decades? I mean, as you're saying, Chris, entire farm businesses, their business model and their financial model was predicated on receiving taxpayer support. And that has now moved from area payments into this more nature-based approach, but we're still at quite an early stage. And, you know, what is it now? 6 years since that policy was first being set out in outline. We've had various iterations of it, had a change of government, but the direction of travel is a good one. Getting the details right to make sure that we get public investments levering outcomes for nature. I mean, this is quite complicated, genuinely quite complicated in terms of how we know whether we've got more birds or insects or plants and how much money, you know, should transfer for that, which means for some of it, we're still a little bit locked in practices rather than outcomes. And so we're paying people for doing particular things, and that can be a little bit clunky as well. But the DEFRA team are working very hard on this. Ministers are paying close attention to it. So hopefully we continue to make more progress over the coming period. And actually there is some money there. So back to the last question and, you know, the big budget setting exercise that Treasury does, we did finish up with the farm budget at least static. I mean, it's a decline because of inflation and everything else, but at least it wasn't a cut. So there is still some money there to be able to do some of the things that we need to do. But I do think it's a mindset thing, isn't it, really? I mean, a lot of this stuff comes down to a very broad way of looking at the world. And this goes back to Gabe Brown's point about seeing things differently rather than just doing things differently, and seeing things in the sense of nature as our biggest ally for food security is very different from we've got to produce as much food as possible as quickly as possible, and the damage to soils and pollution is a regrettable consequence, which is where quite a lot of people are still located. So how we shift that mindset into both and nature and food security is a huge, big piece of work. And again, I don't think it's got everything to do with data and numbers. This is about culture and philosophy of the farming community. And I think the people who are going to be most influential in that is not the likes of me or Natural England scientists, it's going to be the farmers. And so getting the farmers to begin a conversation amongst themselves about how they go into a different place compared to where they've been, I think probably is the most important thing that can be done. And so congratulations for you in being able to insert some of this discussion into that community. But it's not without positive consequence already. I mentioned groundswell, and I really was struck there this year by the energy in that place, how many people were there, and a very different demographic to many farming conferences I go to. Much younger, many more women in it, a different kind of picture in terms of the future of farming. And I think, you know, this meeting today, you know, kind of a 10th anniversary, may be a good invitation to think about 10 years hence, and where this discussion will be in 10 years' time, where we would like it to be in 10 years' time, and what we can do from today and over those years to get it into that place. And a lot of it is going to be about hearts and minds as much as it is about data and about helping people to see things differently. And you would hope that, you know, what's going on at the moment, I mean, anyone who's in farming right now will just be utterly struck by last year, couldn't plant anything because it was underwater. This year we can't plant anything because the soil's blowing away because it's turned into dust. And I mean, this is within 12 months. And so, this may begin to open a new conversation as we're now into this period of visible change rather than future change. And as I say, the positive energy I'm getting out of many people in the farming community now working through landscape recovery, farmer clusters, groundswell, there is a change underway. And in 10 years' time, hopefully we'll be in a different place. I think we will be, despite all of the kind of countervailing headwinds. I think people are beginning to understand all of this. I mean, the other thing about the food side, really important, is it's not just about agriculture, it's about the whole food system and our food culture. People eating rubbish, it's killing them. We're putting 1/3 of the food in the bin in total. That's 1/3 of the land producing food for compost and incinerators. I mean, this is total insanity. And some of these pieces need to be connected up. And hopefully the new ministers at DEFRA will be amongst the people who are doing that. I think they will.
One more question. Is it going to be?
Thank you, Tony, for an excellent speech, inspiring. But there's one thing I've heard missing. You didn't mention the word education in the whole speech. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, education in its broadest sense, I think, is key to all of this. I suppose the closest I came was about culture and our kind of collective worldview, which in the end is derived out of experiences that we all have, which increasingly are being shaped by these darn things. Adverts, AI, buy this, get the other, and that is taking us further from where we need to be. I mean, I'm sure many people in this room who've spent a lot of time trying to do something about these big issues, they probably are doing it because of experiences they had as little children. And that's certainly my way into all of this as a kid, was being a naturalist. And that kind of leads you into a kind of different worldview compared to the one which shapes so many experiences today. And, education, you might see that through the prism of what schools teach and the curriculum and everything else. And there are people doing some good work on that. And the Natural History GCSE, which I think finally we've got over the line now with Department for Education. Actually, I have a meeting with Education Minister next week where we'll get onto some of these things about how we can connect nature into schools, and not only through the formal curriculum of what you learn about birds and insects and everything, but also how the school grounds are managed. And actually, one of the ideas that I've tried to insert into this conversation is whether we might invite the schools of England to put 30% of their land aside for nature recovery as part of the 30 by 30 target. And it wouldn't add many hectares, but it would be transformative in getting engagement with the youngsters in terms of we're making a contribution. We've got some wetlands, we've got some native shrubland coming in, we're encouraging birds in, no pesticides on the school grounds, all of that kind of thing, some swift boxes up on the sports hall, all of that as a way of getting engagement into the school. Beyond, sitting down and learning in a classroom. So there's that. The other thing, I mean, sometimes in Cambridge, I'll speak to business audiences and they'll hear some versions of what I said today and they'll be absolutely terrified because unlike all of you, they would never have heard any of this before. It's amazing how many people don't know what's going on. And they will say, what can we do? And my answer to them very often will be, well, if you've got children, grandchildren, nephews or nieces, and if you don't have any of those, borrow someone else's children and take them outside and start identifying some birds and insects together instead of going shopping. And that kind of, I think that sticks a little bit.